So, Gurcharan, let me dive right in. You've written a fantastic memoir, Another Sort of Freedom. Early on in life, you were inspired by Nehruvian socialism. What was the process of you moving from that to the champion of liberalism that you became?
We bought every word of Nehru, including his socialism. But when I started working, I began to see the dark side of socialism. My first job was a company that made Vicks Vapor Rub. And one year there was a flu and the sales of Vicks Vapor Rub went through the roof. And just when we were celebrating, the company lawyer brought a summons that we had broken the law.
There are labor reforms, farm law reforms that this government has tried to do but has gotten stymied in its attempts. And I think that brings us back to this idea that you need to popularize the philosophy behind the reforms.
I'm driving to work. I hear on NPR very disturbing news 2 years after the reforms, and I hear that the reforms have stopped. The left wing of the Congress party and the left overall, they might even reverse the reforms. I had met Manmohan Singh. I had shot off a telegram to him. I said, why isn't anybody selling the reforms to the public? And why are we just doing the reforms quietly, chori chori, chupke chupke? So there are many things going for our country, but we still have to do reforms. Land acquisition, labor codes, the farm laws. But many areas of the ease of doing business, we are very weak. If I were Mr. Modi, I would tell Adani, Ambani, everybody, look, you go and make huge big factories. Put up factories which employ hundreds and thousands of people.
Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of Fed Dialogues. We have today with us Gurcharan Das. He needs no introduction, but I will attempt a small one anyway. He used to be CEO of Procter & Gamble before becoming an author. He wrote fantastic books and a column that I still remember from growing up, which had a big part to play in my own orientation later in life towards economic liberal thought. And I'm sure many others like me, Gurcharan. So thank you for joining us. Welcome.
Thank you.
Yeah. So Gurcharan, let me dive right in. You've written a fantastic memoir, Another Sort of Freedom. I had the privilege of reading some of the early drafts of it. And one thing really struck me that you mentioned early on in life, you were inspired by Nehruvian socialism, right? And you yourself call yourself a socialist in some of the early chapters. What was the process of you moving from that to the champion of liberalism that you became and have been throughout your life and career?
Well, you know, I grew up in the age of hope. This is just after Azadi, and I remember we were living in Bhakra Nangal.
Right.
My father was helping to build the great dam at Bhakra Dam. And Jawaharlal Nehru came to visit, and he gave a great speech about calling Bhakra one of the temples of modern India. And men like my father, they were so inspired by him that they truly felt they were working for a higher cause. And that's how we felt. And we bought every word of Nehru, including his socialism, and we were all socialists at the time. But when I started working, I began to see the dark side of socialism. That, you know, at that time, the model of socialism was the Soviet Union. And Nehru asked a man, Mahalanobis, to give a model for India's development, but within a democratic framework. I mean, we were a proud democratic country, and Nehru deserves full credit for the institutions that he espoused and helped create in our country. Mahalanobis gave him the command economy model of the Soviet Union. The public sector was to be at the commanding heights of the economy, that profit was a dirty word, and the private sector had to be micromanaged. And so what we had really was many sectors of the economy were just not open to competition. We had a government monopolies. So I started working. My first job was a company that made Vicks Vapor Rub. And one year there was a flu and the sales of Vicks Vapor Rub went through the roof. And I mean, we kept the factory work 3 shifts to make sure that the chemist shops were stocked, the shelves were stocked with the product. And by the end of the year, we were feeling very good that we had done something great, during an epidemic. We had brought relief to millions of families. And just when we were celebrating, the company lawyer brought a summons from the government. And it told us that we had broken the law, which was the law which said that we were allowed to produce so many tons of Vicks Vapor Rub per year. So I was hauled up to Delhi, and we were waiting. We waited 2 hours outside, we meaning that there were 2 lawyers with me, waited outside the office of a joint secretary, and finally we were ushered into his office. He was reading the newspaper. And we had sat down. We were too polite to go do something like that, to tell him that we were there. He kept reading the paper, but finally he put it down. And then he said, "Kya?" And I said, "Sir, आप बताइए क्या? आपने हमें बुलाया है यहाँ." So he said, No, I have not read your file. What's the problem? I said, "You've asked us here with this summons." And he looked at the summons. So he said, "You've broken the law." So I explained to him that there was a flu and that we thought we were doing good for the country, producing for the nation. And he listened to me, but he finally said, "No, but you've broken the law." And he says, "Now the law will take its course. I want to make an example of your company, because you guys, especially you multinationals, you think you can get away with murder in our country just because we are a poor country. And I want to put you guys in your place, that no one is above the law." So at this point the lawyers were shivering, and then he says, "Jao." He threw us out of the office. But at the door, I turned around. I don't know where I got the courage to say this, but I said, "Sir, the news will come out. We are a multinational company, and all the world will know that you sent an executive of a company to jail. And why? And they'll find out, and they'll ask, how do you think our country will look when they see that here was a company doing something good, and this is how you rewarded the company." There was, by the way, a 3-year jail sentence associated with breaking this law. Anyway, he said, "Are you threatening me?" I said, "No, I'm just telling you this will happen." Anyway, he says, "Jao." And we went out, and the lawyers were angry with me, and they said, "You should have fallen at his feet, begged for mercy, and look at you, you were threatening him." Anyway, I had many sleepless nights, but the government quietly dropped the inquiry and dropped this case. But I switched from being a socialist that day to become a classical liberal. And then following week, I joined the Swatantra Party. And in fact, Pilu Modi became one of my best friends in Bombay. And so that was how I converted.
Amazing. And the story you speak of is, I mean, it's an anecdote, but it's so emblematic of what happens when political power is the way that you make decisions about who to produce and what to buy and everything, right? So the government had these laws and rules that were so strongly in place that ran across every decision that the private sector could make.
Yeah.
So, I mean...
I'll tell you, Rahul, the fact is that we were told where to locate our factory. We had no choice. We were told what technology we could use. We were told, we were asked how many workers we could employ, and if we employed less, they could haul us up for not employing the number of workers. So they really micromanaged all decisions. And there were things like DGTD, whose job was to check what kind of technology we were using, etc., etc.
Right.
So you can tell. I mean, it was lunacy.
Absolutely. And you were one of the first people when you wrote India Unbound to document in a very, very engaging way the changes that were happening in India. You were one of the first to predict that India would turn into a place of boundless energy and enthusiasm.
And it's hard to blame Nehru because everybody was a socialist in the world. In other words, thinking, except the United States, but the rest of the world, and India was applauded. Nehru was applauded by the academics, by policymakers for what he was doing. But by Indira Gandhi's time, there was already, the world had seen another way from changing a poor country to a rich country. And that was the East Asian model. First it was Japan that rose, then Taiwan, then Korea, Hong Kong, Singapore, and most recently it has been China. And there's been one mantra, which is through the export of simple, everyday, low-tech, labor-intensive manufactures.
You can create wonders.
That was very simple. And India was told again and again, look at these countries who went on to become Asian tigers. And they went from becoming poor countries to developed countries within 1 or 2 generations.
Yeah.
And at Indira's time, the evidence was there. And for her to have actually turned the opposite way and made the license ride even more constricting, nationalizing banks, MRTP, all these things she brought about in the name of Garibi Hatao. And the end, when the economists look at those years from 1950 to 1980, they see that very little was done for the poor.
You're absolutely right.
What we did in the end was we sacrificed 2 generations of our country in missed opportunities. So we got our freedom, true freedom, economic freedom in 1991. In 1947 we only got our political freedom.
Yeah.
But very quickly we lost our economic freedom to the mantra of what is they called mixed economy. Nehru called mixed economy, but my friend Pilu Modi called it a mixed up economy.
It's a fantastic phrase. One more thing, Gurcharan. when we got our economic independence, as I was saying, you were one of the foremost surveyors of what was happening in India and the possibilities. And I remember reading with great interest your articles that used to come out at the time, and it shaped me a lot. And recently again I was going through that archive, thanks to you and me discussing a project together, and it struck me, how much in that archive, how much that you were asking for remains true till today. You talk about labor reforms, you talk about local governance reforms being needed, and in some ways, I mean, you can say that that's the enduring nature of the fundamental things that you're asking for, but in some ways it also represents that since the move towards economic independence in 1991, we have not made substantially more progress. There has been incremental progress, but it's been more of the nature of 2 steps forward, 1.5 steps back. So just wanted your perspective on that.
Yeah, well, I'm a little more optimistic than that, Rahul. But let me just quickly tell you that in my memoir, I also recount why I quit the corporate world.
Right.
I was at the world headquarters at that time, managing director for global corporate strategy for Procter & Gamble. And one fine day, I'm driving to work. I hear on NPR very disturbing news. It's 2 years after the reforms, and I hear that the reforms have stopped. The left wing of the Congress party and the left overall is going, looks like they might even reverse the reforms. I get worried because I'm a man who believes that India got Azadi in 91. And so I had met Manmohan Singh when he was a nobody in the 80s, early 80s. And so I had shot off a telegram to him. At that time he was now finance minister, but he was very sweet. He replied. I said, why isn't anybody selling the reforms to the public? And why are we just doing the reforms quietly, chori chori, chupke chupke? And I mean, I was basically saying to him, why don't you, the Prime Minister and other people, sell the reforms to the public every night? And I mean, I remember that Margaret Thatcher used to say that she spent 20% of her time doing the reforms, 80% selling the reforms. And Deng Xiaoping in China was at the same time talking about the market and being rich is glorious, and a cat will catch any kind, what color, it doesn't matter as long as it catches mice. So these two converted the nation, and we were almost apologetic about it. And so, in fact, it was to the point that Narasimha Rao didn't even convert his own party. He didn't convert the parliament, let alone the public. And you know, it's not easy. For the ordinary person, even for an intellectual, to understand that millions of people working for their own profit result because of an invisible hand that Adam Smith said bring the whole society to prosperity. Now that's not an easy thing to grasp because it's invisible. Anyway, Manmohan Singh said, come back to India and you come back and sell the reforms. He knew. By then, by the way, I had written op-eds in the papers. Also, I had been a weekend writer in my 20s and 30s. And now I was in my late 40s when all this was happening. And so, frankly, I convinced my wife. She was horrified at first. She said, just when we are earning big money, you want to quit? And I explained to her that we had enough savings. This was going to be our expenses. This was would be our income from savings, and we could make it. Now her standard of living wouldn't go up, but it hopefully wouldn't go down too much. Anyway, she was a good sport, and we came back. And luckily, Times of India, in a year of writing op-eds, gave me a regular column to write. And so I started doing the selling of the market and selling of the reforms. So now, Rahul, to come back to your question, it is now 30 years since the reforms began. And India in this period has grown at almost 6%. Now, for a democracy, especially an argumentative, feisty democracy like ours, it's quite amazing. And in fact, it's unprecedented in the world. So we should be very proud of this growth. But the reality is, and this is where we have failed, the reality is that we have not created the jobs that 6% growth should have created. We have not created an industrial revolution. And so, therefore, we have almost jumped from a green revolution, become a surplus, from a deficit agriculture to a surplus agriculture country, exporters of agriculture. We have gone to a software, IT, digital revolution, services revolution with outsourcing and so on. All great stuff, but we have skipped the middle. And so how are we going to take 45% of our population, which is on the farms, to a higher productivity, higher income life? We did not follow, which we were told to follow, the model which was the model of the Asian tigers. And we could have done it. So, the question now is that, well, certainly, I don't want to spend too much time analyzing why, but it really partly goes back to the fact that over these 30 years, we've had many leaders doing the reform. Even during Deva Gowda's time, who used to fall asleep on his papers. You had Chidambaram's dream budget, 1997. And when Vajpayee came, he did many reforms in telecom, reforms in the electronics policy. And similarly, after that, Manmohan Singh came again and did some reform. So we've had incremental, slow, frustratingly slow reform, but this has added up. And so today, we are in a much better position to create that industrial revolution. I know some people say, oh, but the world is turning to robotics and how will we do it? No. The fact is that the world exports of goods manufactured goods is $26 trillion today. Our share is less than 2%. That's very sad for an economic powerhouse. We are right now sitting on a robust, dynamic economy, the fastest growing this year in the world. But we still have to create an industrial revolution. But what I'm saying is that we are now in a position to do it. Now, to do that, there's a lot of things positive. Infrastructure has improved. Our road mileage is double of what it was in 2011. Our port handling capacity is quadruple to 2011. we've had a digital revolution, and that means bank accounts have gone up from 42% of the population to 90% of the population. So there are many things going for our country, but we still have to do reforms. Meaning not only we have to do the 3 reforms that Mr. Modi's government was unable to do in these last 10 years, land acquisition, labor codes, and the farm laws, but many areas of the ease of doing business, enforcement of contracts, etc. We are very weak. So all these will be needed, and even Modi, he has done, his government brought the GST, which made the country one.
That's right.
So there have been many such reforms. And so I would say that no matter who comes to power in 2024, this has to be the priority. We can do it, and this will then allow us to see that the majority of our population from today, as a result of the reforms, we have lifted 400 million people above poverty line. The middle class has grown from 10% to 30%. If we do this, we'll be in the same position as China or other places where the middle class is over 50%. And so I think that really is the job that we have to do.
That's a very important and good corrective to my perhaps too pessimistic outlook, Gurcharan. So thank you. And I think I really appreciate your focus on this export-led industrial revolution that we need to lift a bulk of people out of agriculture. I think you're so right in pointing out that 45% of people still on the farm, you really need something that can raise them to a higher wage level, a higher income level, and the only path that has succeeded there is the East Asian path that you were talking about. And I think, like you also said, there are labor reforms, farm law reforms that this government has tried to do but has gotten stymied in its attempts. And I think that brings us back to this idea that you need to popularize the philosophy behind the reforms, that those ideas must be embedded. And here I think again you're a unique person who has studied these reforms from a liberal classical Western side of the story, but you're also a deep student of the Indian tradition. Sanskrit, you mentioned in your book, was something that you took up in great detail. So just from all of that study, what do you think we can call and bring to bear on this issue of popularizing reforms?
Yes, but before I answer your question, just to finish the last point,
please.
I forgot to mention that, you know, for the kind of reforms we need to become an exporter. For example, PLI scheme today, it's a good idea. I mean, generally I'm very wary of industrial policy like that, but we have tasted success with cell phones, and the export of cell phones now is just going to grow exponentially. Similarly, it will happen with laptops and other areas. And what we need though is labor intensive manufacturers. Now electronics is a labor intensive area. Toys, garments, all these things. We should tweak the PLI scheme to reward exports, not just production. In fact, we don't need to reward production at all. Reward things that we want done. Reward labor intensity without making the company uncompetitive. Very often, as I've run companies, it's a close call. Should we get a new machine or should we hire a few more people? And so I would say, since this is an area, we need to create large companies who are exporters. In fact, the single biggest, during the license Raj, the single biggest deterrent to the export of labor-intensive manufactures was SSI, Small Scale Industry Reservation. And it was not brought by the Congress, by the way. It was the Janta government that brought it, but it stayed on the books till 2007. And therefore, the Indian industrialist is just got into the habit that these 750 industries were closed to big industry. Now these things take time, and so I would just say, if I were Mr. Modi, I would tell Adani, Ambani, everybody, Tata's big guys, look, you go and make huge big factories. The labor codes have become friendly. We are going to make you competitive in every way, and put up factories which employ hundreds and thousands of people. That would be the way to do it. And the PLI schemes should also have a sunset clause on tariffs, that you guys, we are not going to keep you infant industry forever. After 5 years or 6 years, the tariffs will come down to global levels so that India can join the global supply chains. You know, that was a small point.
No, fantastic
point. But it's a nitty-gritty kind of thing. But to answer your question, you know, actually this whole period of socialist Raj, licensed Raj, goes against the ethos of our country, where the trader, the Vaishya, the Banya was a respected member of society. In fact, the Vaishya is one of the upper, Janau pehne wala, upper classes, and he had a respected place in society. And the king in the Arthashastra is told that you don't own the land, you have 15% of the produce of the land is the maximum that you are allowed to tax the people or the trader. 15% is the just tax rate that is provided in the ancient tax. And in fact, the merchant is celebrated. And I'll tell you one of the nicest stories, since we are today in an age of startups. It's a 12th century story from a Sanskrit text called Katha Sarit Sagara. And it's a story of a boy who grows to be 17. They are poor, and his mother cleans houses to keep them going, the family going. And she tells him, now, you are not going to do what I do, you have a great destiny. And she tells him that you go over there, is the richest man in town, that's his mansion over there. Go and stand outside his door. He's a kind man, ask him for advice on what you should do. So the boy dutifully goes the next day and stands outside the rich man's house, and he sees a dead mouse in the courtyard. And when the man comes out, he asks the man, the rich man, can I have that mouse? The rich guy laughs. He says, nobody has asked me that. They come to me asking for money or a job or something like that. Can I do anything else for you? The boy says, no, thank you. So he takes that dead mouse. He knows in the neighborhood there's a widow who has a cat. He sells the mouse as cat food, and with a few paisa he goes to the bazaar, buys some chana, spicy chana, makes puriyas out of it, and takes a ghada of pani, goes to the center of town, and he waits because in the afternoon come loggers from the forest, and they come bearing logs of wood on their head, and they put their load down, and this boy gives to each one water and chana. And nobody has done that for them. They're so happy that, and they don't have any money, so they each give him a log of wood. The next day, he sells one log, gets better quality snack for these loggers, and for 3 months he does the same thing until the rains come, monsoons come, the price in the timber market starts shooting up. And the boy starts, but he has a house full of logs. He starts unloading his logs, and by the end of the season, he has got enough money to buy a timber shop in the timber market. And he has one competitive advantage. The loggers know him and they are beholden to him. So they come to him always first with the best pieces of wood. And so the guy in 2 years has become a successful timber merchant. When he realizes that there is margin in timber is thin, that there's more money, more higher margin to convert the wood into something else like a ship. So he gets a master carpenter who's a shipbuilder, and he finances him and he makes him a partner, and they start a company building ships. And in 2 years there's a big success as a shipbuilding company. And then he realizes that the guys who buy his ships actually are making more money sending cargo and passengers on their ships. So he gets a third and subsidiary started, gets a retired captain of a ship company and makes him his partner, and soon he's in the shipping business. By the age of 25, he has become the richest man in town, and he goes to a jeweler and asks him to make him a gold mouse. And then with that gold mouse, he goes to the house of this rich man, and in today's language he says, this is your return on your venture capital investment, which was a dead mouse. And that man is so delighted with this story that he gives his daughter in marriage to this boy. You see, we have celebrated entrepreneurship.
Always.
And what is nice about this period, another positive thing is that startups are the ones that create the big jobs. Why? There was a study done by a professor at MIT. In my book India Unbound, I tell this story. The MIT professor found, he did a study of 25 years of American economy, and he found that in these 25 years, the jobs, 80% of the jobs were not created by the big giants like Exxon or IBM and so on, nor were they made by the mom and pop stores, the kirana walas, etc. They were created by startups that went big. I mean, the examples that time were DHL, FedEx and so on, who were creating the big jobs in America. So I think this government has encouraged startups, but we need startups in the brick and mortar economy. Most of our startups are in the digital economy, which will have a limited effect on jobs. I mean, they won't create that kind of labor intensity that we need.
Absolutely. No, and that story that you told in your usual masterful storyteller fashion, Gurcharan, was so fantastic, right? I think the idea that commerce creates value where previously nothing existed, just by finding transactions where both parties are better off, is such a fantastic idea to come out of our own stories, our own ethos. And I wish there were more people telling such stories. And I wish I could hear more stories like this from you, but we are losing light. And I think
And it's thundering.
Yeah, it's thundering. So I think we will call this episode to a close, but hope to have you back on this, Gurcharan. Thank you so much for talking to us, and I'm sure people will love this episode. Thank you.
Thank you.